Hey life group leaders, I hope you're doing well. This video I'm going to go over Ezra chapter 6. So as we continue our study of the Gospel Project, we have a great opportunity to see the way in which God sovereignly works behind the scenes to draw his people to where he wants them to be and the joyful response of those people to what God is doing. So when we look at chapter 6, I'm going to start with the question, what has God done in our lives to lead us to worship him? As we look at this chapter, there's a lot that takes place, especially in the first six chapters of Ezra. We see a lot of things, and actually, a lot of time has passed because we look at several kings in Persia have ruled, and now we're coming to King Darius and his decree to ensure that Israel has what they need to build the temple, to finish their work, and to continue to thrive back in the promised land. And so, as we are working through these verses, I want to help our people see ultimately, God sovereignly works out all things for our good, and our response should be joyful worship for what he has done. And so as we look at that, I want to encourage you, think about how to get your people to look at the text to see how God is at work in Darius and how he's working through a Persian king to provide for his people in Israel. I have a head cold, so I apologize for the congestion. But as we look at this lesson, please consider how we can encourage our people to think deeply about who God is and why we should be worshiping him and joyful in that worship, because what God has done is so much bigger than we can even imagine, that in the day to day, if we don't meditate on the things of what God is doing, it's easy for our finite minds to forget how good God is and what God's done. And so as we encourage our people, it's really important for them to see God working behind the scenes, and how in the text we can see God is near to his people, working out all that he has promised for them to provide for their needs and to ensure that they'll be in the promised land. So in my notes that I'm sharing, I include a brief timeline as well as some characters to give some overview, because as we jump from chapter 3 to 6, we don't cover a lot of the oppressors that we see in chapter 4, and really just the continuation of Israel through the prophets Zechariah and Haggai, and how their ministries is actually bolstering the spirit of Israel to do what the Lord wants. Because as they return, when you read Zechariah and Haggai, we see that while they started to work on the temple, they started to drift away from doing what God called them to do, and they started focusing on their own houses. And we even see the state of their hearts, that they're not truly following the Lord, that there's still sin issues, and they need to repent, and they need to pursue holiness. And so as we look at this chapter, there's a lot in the background that we're going to miss. So hopefully my notes can help with that. I do provide a list of the kings and a brief timeline, as I said, because as we look at this, with the story of Esther is taking place around a similar time, and there's just a lot of pieces. So I want to encourage you to take a look at that when you get a chance. But my structure for this chapter, I'm going to focus on first I want to look at verses 6 through 10 and how we see Israel is given permission to rebuild the temple. Then I'm going to look at verses 11 through 12 and the consequences for those that oppose Israel in this rebuilding effort. And then finally, we'll look at verses 16 through 22, which talks about Israel's worship of God and how it's filled with joy. And so as we do that, there's, like I said, there's a lot of layers, but because we're jumping from 3 to 6, there's some pieces that I put in my notes that to help me remember contextually. Chapter 3, we saw that they were rebuilding the temple and the altar. In chapter 4, we learned about the oppressors, the adversaries they deal with. And then chapter 5, we see they begin rebuilding. And then as we come to chapter 6, while we won't focus a lot on the first 5 verses, we learned that Darius is actually unsure of previous decrees that were made on behalf of Israel. And so he actually commissions his people to go to the Babylonian archives and see what Ezra, that we see in Ezra 5, this revelation of Cyrus's permission. And once he comes to confirm that that was actually the case, he wants to uphold what was established so that Israel can continue to rebuild. So that by the time we get to verses 6 through 10, we actually see that not only does Darius decree that Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and those that are kind of working against Israel are to stay away from Israel. In fact, not only are they to stay away from their rebuilding efforts, but they're actually to give them the resources from the royal revenue. And so to bolster them, we see Darius decrees give them everything they need. So give them freedom to build, give them space to do what they need to do, provide the funding for the rebuilding efforts, but he also gives them the means to do worship. He gives them bulls, rams, sheep, all kinds of sacrificial elements, as well as wheat, wine, oil. And we see that not only does he encourage them to have this religious freedom, but that he also wants Israel to pray for Darius and the king and his sons. And so he's asking them, hey, I'm giving these things to you. In turn, I want you to pray for the prosperity of our nation, which may seem radical, but it's interesting because God is using Persian kings to bolster his people, to provide their religious freedom, to give them the things they need to make their sacrifices, as well as showing that God is sovereign over all nations. And so God is at work. Encourage your people. When we look at these first few verses, we see God is present. He is being faithful. He's not abandoning Israel. He's being faithful to his covenant. He's actually fulfilling the promises he made to Abraham, Moses, and David. And we see that he is providing through their previous captors. And so it's beautiful to see God's faithfulness and love for his people, because we'll see at the end of the chapter the response of his people. So, transitioning to verses 11 and 12, we actually see Cyrus make another decree. If anyone opposes what he has decreed, then we see that they are to be punished severely, so much so that they will be punished by death and that destruction will come on their family. And so we see this public humiliation. But he goes even one step further and he says, look, even in doing this, if you oppose me, anything that alters my decree, you will suffer. And so it's important for us to remember that in chapter 4, Israel was being pursued by other nations trying to slow them down. They went to King Xerxes or Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes and asking them to hinder Israel's progress. And it's as if they had forgotten what Cyrus previously had commanded back in Ezra 1. So we're actually looking at a significant time frame. And so, I mean, even their rebuilding efforts was put on hold for 20 years. So even though they may have returned, near the end of the 70 years, there's still several decades of oppression that they go through. And it's not just a quick rebuilding cycle. And so the fact that God is using Darius is really interesting, because we see that nothing will stop God's will from coming true or to completion. And so as we look at that, 13 through 15, we see that the oppressors and accusers submit to Darius's order. We see that they go forward. We see Israel prospers because of the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah. And then we get to 16 through 22, and we see this beautiful picture of Israel worshiping God with joy. So a lot of this section focuses on them completing the temple and then making offerings to the Lord, because originally they didn't even have this opportunity in Babylon. And so now God is giving them the opportunity to make sin offerings and dedication offerings. And so while it's not as grand as it was when Solomon dedicated the temple in 1 Kings, we do see that they are coming back and they are restarting their worship practices. They have the altar, they have the temple, they have all these sacrifices. And so they celebrate, they make offerings to the Lord according to the book of Moses. And we see that they put the priests and the Levites properly over the 12 tribes. And so for the 42,000 that return, now they're giving them what they need to function according to God's instruction. And it's beautiful, it's wonderful. And we see how even the sin offering, it should stir something in our minds when we hear that. Our ears should perk up when we hear that, because who is the ultimate sin offering? It was Christ. And so it's helpful for us to show how this text points to Christ, because we know that he was the sacrificial lamb who would die in our place, which leads us to verses 19 through 21. They actually celebrate the Passover meal. And for those that, if it's been a while or you don't remember, the Passover meal celebrates the exodus from Egypt. The Passover meal was the beginning of their departure. They would come together, they would sacrifice a lamb, they would take the blood, they would mark the frame of their door to their house, and if they trusted God, they would actually be set free from the wrath that would come to those that didn't have the sacrificial lamb's protection. Which, again, that language, we should think about what Christ did for us on the cross. He was the perfect sacrifice, without blemish, without any defect. And he died on the cross in our place. He was the perfect substitute. And he took the wrath of God on the cross in our place so that we could live. And so as you work through this, help them see what Christ has done. My notes will go through that deeper. But we see that because of faith through the sacrificial lamb, their sins were atoned. And again, we see that through Christ, our sins are atoned for. And so the other thing to note is near the end of that section, we see that it's not only Israel worshiping God, but there are other nations with them. And even so much so that it says that they set themselves apart from uncleanness. So we see Jew and Gentile celebrating and praising God, which is a foretaste of what we see in the New Testament when the Gentiles come into the spiritual Israel. We see that the church begins to grow, and it's Jew and Gentile. But then we're going to land on verse 22, and it talks about how they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was a 7-day feast where they would have bread that didn't have leaven in it, because as they were leaving Egypt, they had to leave quickly. So they had to prepare bread that they could make quickly so they could have food to survive in the wilderness. But the leaven, removing that leaven from the bread, symbolized removing the sin from their lives. And so as they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it was to help them reorient their minds as they are worshiping the Lord. They need to set their lives apart for the Lord. And so as they did this, we say that they have joyful hearts because they're able to celebrate the Lord, but also for what the Lord had done in turning the hearts of the king of Assyria, of Persia, all of them, to help them get back to Jerusalem and worship the Lord. And so I want to encourage you as we help our people see this. God is at work, even in the details we don't always notice. So when we apply this text, encourage your people. Help them to see that God is faithful to help us to do what He's called us to do, to provide for our needs. And because of that, we should joyfully worship Him. When we gather, encourage your people. We shouldn't show up and just stare like mindless zombies when it's time to praise our King. We need to be joyful in our worship. And I think sometimes we forget that. And so encourage your people to reflect on what God has done in the past, what He's doing in the present, and what He will do, because that should help us to be joyful in our worship of the Lord. Another thing to encourage our people, Israel required a temple, right? We see that the temple was a foreshadow of the heavenly place where God dwelt, as the book of Hebrews shows. But we don't have to go to a temple. We don't have to make sacrifices. Christ completed all that work for us. Now we, through the Spirit, are indwelled by God's presence. And now we get to enjoy the blessing of God with us. But we also have His written word, which reveals His voice of what He expects His people to do and how He expects His people to live. So encourage your members. Are they reading the word regularly? Are they praying to God regularly? Are they seeking His blessing? Are they seeking His direction for their lives? Because now we don't have to go to the temple. We are a temple. Because as the word says, we are filled with His Spirit just like the temple was. And now wherever we go, God is with us. So encourage your people. God is always at work. And because of what He's done, we can joyfully worship Him. Life group leaders, if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. My door is always open to you. I love you. I'm praying for you. I'm grateful for what you do. And I look forward to hearing from you. Have a blessed Sunday. God bless.